You don't hear the bullet that kills you, but the ones that miss. They sound like snapping wet towels. That's what Chief Cora Davies heard as she stared across a churning, muddy artery of water. On the other side, 280 Marines were pinned in the mud, bleeding out while enemy mortars walked closer. History loves a hero, but in the mud there are no heroes. There's just the smell of copper, the freezing rain, and the sickening realization that nobody else is coming. The river didn't have a name on their tactical maps. It was just a jagged blue line separating Grid Sector 4 from Grid Sector 5. Today it was a graveyard. Cora lay flat on her stomach, the cold silt soaking through her combat shirt, pressing the binoculars against the bridge of her nose. The rain wasn't falling, it was driving horizontally, a miserable, stinging spray that tasted like diesel exhaust and pulverized rock. Beside her, Brody chewed on the inside of his cheek, a nervous tic he developed somewhere in Ramadi a decade ago. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Across the 80 yards of rushing brown water, Fox Company was being systematically dismantled. 280 Marines had pushed across the pontoon bridge at 0400. At 0415, the enemy artillery found the bridge. Cora had watched it happen. 1 second, a line of armor and heavy infantry was rolling over the floating steel grates. The next second, the air sucked inward. A concussive thump rattled her teeth, and the bridge was gone, replaced by a towering geyser of orange flame and twisting metal. Now, the Marines were trapped on the far bank with their backs to a river, swollen by 3 days of torrential rain. In front of them, a mechanized infantry battalion was tightening the noose. "Any word from the birds?" Cora asked, her voice flat, devoid of the panic that was slowly strangling the command net in her earpiece. "Grounded," Brody rasped, wiping a smear of mud from his optic. "Anti-air batteries in the tree line to the north. Command says it's a meat grinder. They aren't sending the Black Hawks into a wall of flak." Cora lowered the binoculars. She shifted her weight, feeling the heavy pull of the medical ruck strapped to her back. As a SEAL, she was trained to kill. As a Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman, she was trained to keep people from dying. Right now, both skill sets felt entirely useless. Through the magnification, she had seen the grim reality. The Marines had no cover. They were dug into shallow depressions, firing blindly into the tree line. Every 3 minutes, a mortar round shrieked out of the grey sky and slammed into the earth. Mud and bodies went flying. The casualty rate was exponential. They didn't have a surgeon. They barely had combat lifesavers. The math played out in Cora's head, cold and unforgiving. 280 men. A 10% casualty rate per hour. No medevac. No reinforced armor. Massive hemorrhage kills in 3 minutes. Tension pneumothorax kills in 10. "They're going to die," she said, pulling her gloves tighter. The Velcro made a harsh, ripping sound that seemed too loud for the battlefield. "Command is working on a flanking maneuver," Brody said. He didn't look at her. He knew it was a lie. A flank would take 12 hours. Fox Company didn't have 12 minutes. Cora stared at the water. The current was brutal, choked with splintered tree trunks and the shattered remains of the pontoon bridge. The surface looked like boiling tea. A sniper round cracked overhead, that wet towel snap, and embedded itself in the mud 2 feet to her left. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the hole it left in the dirt. She didn't want to go. Every instinct in her body, every survival mechanism honed through years of selections, deployments, and near misses, screamed at her to stay glued to the dirt. Crossing that river was a statistical impossibility. She would freeze, drown, or take a 7.62 millimeter round to the face before she hit the halfway mark. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of fear sitting on her chest. Her stomach soured. She hated this. She hated the cold. She hated the smell of cordite. And she hated the fact that she knew exactly what she was about to do. "Brody," Cora said, her voice dropping an octave. "Give me the heavy line." Brody finally looked at her. His eyes were wide beneath his helmet. "Davies, no. It's suicide. The current is running at 12 knots. You're hauling 80 pounds of gear." "Give me the line, Brody." "Command didn't authorize—" "Screw command," Cora snapped. It wasn't a heroic declaration. It was an exasperated growl. "They're bleeding out. I have whole blood, TXA, and tourniquets. If I can get a line across, we can start ferrying the criticals back. Or I can at least plug the holes until the armor gets here." "You won't make it," Brody said, but his hands were already moving, unspooling the thick, braided static line from his assault pack. Cora didn't argue. She just stripped her plate carrier. If she wore the ceramic plates, she would sink like a stone. She kept her chest rig, the medical ruck, and a sidearm. She ditched her rifle. It felt wrong, like leaving an appendage behind, but she needed her arms free to fight the water. She locked a carabiner to her harness and snapped the static line into it. "If I go under and don't come up," Cora said, her breath fogging in the freezing air. "Cut the line. Don't let me drag you in." Brody gripped her shoulder. The fabric of his glove was rough against her collarbone. "I'll lay down covering fire. Go fast, Davies." Cora looked at the river. The water smelled like copper and dead leaves. She tasted bile in the back of her throat. She swallowed it down, took a breath that felt entirely too shallow, and pushed herself over the embankment. The shock of the water felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just cold. It was a violent, suffocating entity that clamped down on Cora's lungs the second she submerged. The breath was punched out of her. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but blinding, freezing darkness. The roar of the battlefield vanished, replaced by the heavy, thundering sound of the current tearing past her ears. She kicked upward, her boots heavy and uncooperative. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped, sucking in a mouthful of air and silt. The taste was gritty, coating her teeth and throat. Instantly, the current grabbed her, dragging her sideways with terrifying force. She angled her body, aiming upstream, trying to let the water push her across the diagonal. Her arms burned as she clawed at the water. The medical ruck on her back acted like a sail, catching the current and trying to force her face down. Breathe, kick, pull. She repeated the mantra, trying to override the panic circuit firing in her brain. The water was a chaotic mess of debris. A submerged branch slammed into her thigh, bruising the muscle to the bone. She cried out, swallowing another mouthful of filthy water, gagging as it hit her stomach. Above her, the air tore apart. Machine gun fire ripped across the surface of the river, tracing lines of white froth just inches from her face. The enemy on the far ridge had spotted the lone figure fighting the current. Crack, 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 crack. The rounds hissed as they hit the water, losing their kinetic energy just feet beneath the surface, but skipping off the top like lethal stones. Cora dove, ignoring the burning need for oxygen. She swam underwater, her eyes squeezed shut against the stinging debris. The weight of the static line pulling from her harness grew heavier with every yard. It was a dead weight, fighting her progress. Her lungs began to spasm. The darkness behind her eyelids flashed with dull red spots. She had to breathe. She broke the surface, coughing violently. She was halfway across. The far bank was a chaotic blur of grey mud, muzzle flashes, and the dark shapes of Marines huddled in the dirt. Suddenly, the line went taut. Cora was jerked backward, her head dipping below the waves. She thrashed, her hands flying to the carabiner at her waist. The static line had snagged on something submerged, a piece of the ruined bridge or a sunken log. She was tethered, pinned in the middle of the river, while the enemy gunners corrected their aim. Water rushed up her nose. She reached down, her freezing, numb fingers fumbling with the metal clasp of the carabiner. She couldn't feel the gate. She couldn't feel her hands. It was just useless blocks of flesh scraping against metal. Snap, snap, hiss. Rounds struck the water all around her. She was a sitting duck. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally broke through her discipline. She screamed underwater, a bubble of wasted air. With a desperate, violent surge of adrenaline, she yanked a folding knife from her chest rig, flicked the blade open with her thumb, and slashed blindly behind her. The blade caught the heavy nylon rope. She sawed frantically. The rope snapped, the tension vanished, and the current immediately threw her forward, sending her tumbling over a submerged concrete pylon. She slammed into it ribs first. The crack of her own bone was audible, even over the rushing water. The pain was blinding, a sharp, electric spike that radiated from her chest into her jaw. She lost orientation. Up and down ceased to exist. She was rolling, tumbling in the black water, her lungs screaming for air. Her hand brushed against something soft. Silt, the bottom. She kicked off it, her arms flailing, and burst through the surface. The riverbank was 10 feet away. She didn't swim the rest of the way, she clawed. She dug her fingernails into the slick, clay-heavy mud of the embankment and dragged herself out of the water. She collapsed onto her stomach, retching violently, vomiting up river water and bile onto the dirt. Her entire body shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The cold had seeped into her marrow. Before she could even catch her breath, a boot slammed into her shoulder, and the cold steel of an M4 barrel was pressed directly against her temple. "Don't move!" a terrified voice cracked above her. "Hands up! I'll blow your fucking head off!" Cora slowly turned her head, her vision blurred by water and pain. A Marine, no older than 19, was staring down at her. His face was entirely black with soot, his eyes wide and bloodshot with adrenaline. He was shaking just as hard as she was. He hadn't recognized her gear. He just saw something crawl out of the river. "I'm American," Cora wheezed, her voice a ragged croak. She slowly rolled onto her side, pointing to the faded infrared flag patch on her shoulder. "Davies, Corman, lower the weapon, kid." The kid stared at her, blinking furiously. He lowered the rifle an inch. You're a medic." "Yeah," Cora grunted, pushing herself up to her knees, clutching her broken ribs. "Where's your CO?" The world on the far bank was a sensory assault. If the river was cold and indifferent, the Fox Company position was a boiling cauldron of human suffering. The air here was thick. You could practically chew it. It smelled of burnt hair, voided bowels, ozone, and the coppery, rust-like stench of massive arterial bleeding. Cora stayed low, bear-crawling through the mud behind the young Marine. Every time a mortar hit, the ground shuddered, turning the earth into jelly for a split second before compacting it again. Debris rained down constantly. Dirt, splinters, and, occasionally, pieces of things Cora tried not to identify. They reached a massive crater that had been blown out by a 155mm artillery shell earlier in the morning. It was roughly 30 feet wide, and the bottom had filled with a shallow pool of muddy rainwater. This was Fox Company's casualty collection point. It was a butcher shop, 30 men lay in the mud. Some were screaming, a high-pitched, ragged sound that stripped the throat. Others were eerily silent, staring at the grey sky with eyes that didn't blink when the rain hit them. 2 young Marines, regular infantrymen, not medics, were frantically wrapping gauze around a man's missing leg, their hands slipping on the sheer volume of blood. Sitting against the lip of the crater, a radio handset dangling uselessly from his hand, was Captain O'Rourke. His left arm hung at a grotesque angle, the bone tenting the fabric of his sleeve. His face was the colour of old ash. Cora slid down the mud embankment into the crater. O'Rourke looked up at her, his eyes taking a second to focus. When he saw her, a female draped in soaked gear, clutching a massive medical ruck, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he rasped. "Chief Davies, Special Amphibious Recon," Cora said, dropping her ruck in the mud with a heavy squelch. She didn't salute, she didn't offer a pep talk. She just unzipped the main compartment of her bag. "I'm your new doctor." "You came alone?" O'Rourke coughed, spitting a glob of dark blood into the mud. "Halos are grounded. The bridge is gone. You're cut off," Cora said bluntly. There was no point in sugarcoating it. Hope was a liability right now. "I tried to string a line to ferry your wounded across, but it cut loose. We're stuck here until nightfall, or until the armor pushes the flank." O'Rourke let his head fall back against the dirt. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Nightfall is 8 hours away, Chief. We don't have 8 hours. They're massing for a mechanized push through the trees. When the BMPs roll out, this is over." "Then we keep them breathing until the BMPs roll out," Cora said. She turned away from him and looked at the nearest casualty. It was a corporal. His chest plate had caught a piece of shrapnel, but it had deflected downward, tearing open his abdomen. The smell of perforated intestines, a sharp, rotting garbage scent, hit Cora's nose. The kid who had held a gun to her head was kneeling next to the wounded corporal, pressing a filthy rag against his stomach. The kid was crying, silent tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "He's bleeding. He won't stop bleeding. I pushed it in, but it won't stop." Cora dropped to her knees in the mud. Her broken ribs screamed, but she shoved the pain into a tiny, locked box in the back of her mind. She pulled on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. They snapped loudly. "Move," she told the kid. "I can't let go. He'll bleed out." "I said move," Cora barked, shoving the kid aside with her shoulder. She ripped the corporal's uniform open. The wound was a jagged tear, pulsing with dark venous blood. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a package of combat gauze, tore it open with her teeth, and shoved 2 fingers directly into the wound channel, feeling for the severed artery. The flesh was hot, slippery, and alien. The corporal shrieked, his back arching off the mud. He threw a wild punch, his fist glancing off Cora's helmet. "Hold him down!" Cora yelled at the kid. "Pin his shoulders!" The kid scrambled forward, throwing his weight over the corporal. Cora found the bleeder, a slippery, pulsing hose deep in the muscle tissue. She clamped her fingers down on it. The bleeding slowed. With her other hand, she began packing the gauze into the cavity, forcing yard after yard of the hemostatic material into the wound. Packing it so tightly, it felt like shoving concrete into a hole. You're okay, Cora muttered mechanically. She wasn't comforting him. She was just filling the silence. "Keep pressure right here," she ordered the kid, grabbing his hands and forcing them onto the packed wound. "Do not let up. If your hands get tired, put your knee on it. If you let go, he dies. Understand?" The kid nodded rapidly, his jaw trembling. Cora stood up. The mud sucked at her boots. She looked around the crater. 29 more to go. The mortar shells continued to fall, shaking the earth, throwing a fine mist of dirt over the dying. She reached into her ruck and pulled out a Sharpie. She walked to the next man, a sergeant with a massive head wound, grey matter visible beneath a flap of scalp. His breathing was agonal, a deep, rattling gasp every 10 seconds. He was unresponsive. Cora looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. She uncapped the Sharpie, drew a large black X on his forehead, and moved to the next man. A medic from a standard infantry platoon might have stopped, might have tried CPR, might have wasted 20 minutes trying to save the unsavable. But Cora was a Sark. She knew the brutal economics of a mass casualty event. You don't spend $1 on a dead man when you have 50-cent injuries bleeding out in the dirt. She moved through the crater like a machine, tourniquet high and tight on a shattered femur. Needle decompression, a 3-inch needle slammed directly into the chest cavity to vent a collapsed lung. She slapped a panicked Marine across the face, hard enough to rattle his teeth, to break him out of shock so he could hold an IV bag. She was covered in blood. It soaked through her pants, painted her forearms, and smeared across her face when she wiped the rain from her eyes. The cold had vanished, replaced by a suffocating, adrenaline-fueled heat. Thump, thump, thump. The sound came from the tree line. It wasn't the high-pitched shriek of mortars. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of heavy cannons firing. O'Rourke yelled over the din, "Here they come! BMPs! Fix bayonets!" Cora looked up from the chest seal she was smoothing over a bullet hole. Through the driving rain, she saw the tree line shifting. The dark, angular shapes of enemy armored personnel carriers were pushing through the pines, their tracks churning the mud. Dozens of infantrymen moved behind them, shadows in the gloom. They were 50 yards away. Cora looked down at her hands. They were slick with blood, shaking slightly. She had no rifle. She had 3 magazines for her Glock 19. She looked at the Marines in the crater. Half of them were unconscious. The other half were staring at the incoming armor with the dull, glassy eyes of men who had accepted their own deaths. She reached down, unholstered the Glock, and racked the slide. The metallic clack was completely lost in the roar of the incoming fire. The 30mm autocannon on a BMP doesn't sound like a gun. It sounds like a massive, mechanical zipper being ripped open by a giant. The first burst tore through the upper lip of the crater. It didn't just kill the 2 Marines dug in there. It pulverized them, turning sandbags, rifles, and human bone into a fine, pinkish mist that settled over the casualty collection point like a horrific dew. The sheer concussive force of the rounds hitting the dirt made Cora's teeth ache. The armored vehicle was a dark, angular beast, its tracks squealing and grinding against the mud as it pushed through the shattered pines. Behind it, a squad of infantry fanned out, their rifles tracking the American positions. The trap was springing shut. Cora was kneeling in a puddle of muddy blood, a Glock 19 in her right hand. The weapon weighed roughly 24 ounces. The BMP weighed 14 tons. The absurdity of the situation hit her not as panic, but as a cold, cynical spike of annoyance. "I'm a doctor," she thought, wiping a smear of brain matter from her ballistic glasses. "I shouldn't have to fix this." "A T4!" someone screamed from the left flank. "Get the tube up!" Cora turned her head. A corporal, a kid with a patchy mustache and mud caked in his eyelashes, was scrambling up the slick embankment, hefting an olive-drab disposable rocket launcher onto his shoulder. He never made it. A burst of coaxial machine gun fire from the BMP walked across the mud and stitched a line of holes from his hip to his collarbone. He collapsed backward, sliding down the wet clay, the AT-4 tumbling from his grip and landing in the muck at the bottom of the crater. The enemy infantry was 40 yards out now. They were moving in bounds, shouting to each other in short, guttural bursts. The crack of their rifles was distinct, a sharper, higher pitch than the American M4s. Rounds began snapping into the crater, kicking up clods of dirt that struck Cora's helmet like hail. Cora dropped the Glock into the mud. She scrambled towards the dropped rocket launcher, her knees scraping over the jagged debris littering the pit. Every movement sent a white-hot spike of agony radiating from her fractured ribs. She couldn't breathe properly. She was panting in short, shallow gasps, sounding like a dying dog. She reached the corporal. He was alive. His eyes rolled back, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. A sucking chest wound whistled with every ragged breath. Her hands twitched, the muscle memory of the medic screaming at her to seal the box, stop the air leak, grab the tape. She looked at the BMP. It was pivoting its turret, aiming the autocannon directly down into the crater. If she stopped to patch the hole in the corporal's chest, they would all be vaporized in roughly 4 seconds. Do no harm, she thought grimly, shoving the dying man's legs out of the way. She grabbed the AT-4. It was covered in slick, viscous clay. She hauled it onto her right shoulder. She wasn't an anti-armor specialist. She had fired exactly 2 of these in training, 5 years ago. She fumbled with the safety pin, her thick, blood-soaked gloves slipping on the metal ring. "Pull the damn pin!" Captain O'Rourke roared over the din, clutching his shattered arm to his chest. Cora ripped her glove off with her teeth, spitting the nylon fabric into the dirt. Her bare fingers, pale and trembling, hooked the pin and yanked. She popped the sights up. Through the crude plastic crosshairs, the BMP looked massive. It filled her entire field of vision. She could smell the unburned diesel pouring from its exhaust, a heavy chemical stench that burned the back of her throat. She didn't aim for a weak spot. She just aimed for the center of mass. She pressed the firing mechanism. The backblast was violent. A massive jet of flame and overpressure erupted from the rear of the tube, scorching the muddy wall of the crater and kicking up a cloud of blinding dust. The recoil slammed the heavy fiberglass tube backward, the edge of it clipping her helmet and driving her broken ribs down into her lungs. Cora blacked out for a fraction of a second. When her vision cleared, her ears were ringing with a high-pitched electronic whine. The world was utterly silent. She tasted copper. Blood was trickling from both of her nostrils, running warmly over her top lip. Through the drifting smoke, she saw the BMP. The rocket had struck it square in the frontal glacis. It hadn't detonated in a massive Hollywood fireball. Instead, a jet of superheated copper had punched through the armor, igniting the ammunition stored inside. A thick, oily column of black smoke poured from the commander's hatch. A second later, the internal pressure blew the rear doors wide open, vomiting a horrific gout of white flame and the screaming, burning husks of the crew into the mud. The enemy infantry, suddenly stripped of their armor support, hit the dirt. The advance stalled. The American Marines, realizing they weren't dead yet, opened up with everything they had left. The distinct rhythmic thud of an M240 machine gun echoed from a nearby trench, cutting down the retreating figures in the tree line. Cora let the empty fiberglass tube roll off her shoulder. She wiped her bloody nose with the back of her bare hand. She looked down at the corporal she had shoved aside. He had stopped breathing. She had killed a tank, but she had lost her patient. She stared at his grey, lifeless face for a long moment, feeling absolutely nothing. The adrenaline had burned away the grief. She leaned over, picked up her bloody nitrile glove from the mud and pulled it back onto her shaking hand. "Chief!" a voice croaked beside her. It was the kid, the 19-year-old she had barked at earlier. His hands were still clamped tightly over the abdomen of the wounded sergeant. His knuckles were white. "I'm still holding it," the kid said, his voice trembling violently. "But he's getting cold." Cora picked up her medical ruck. "I'm coming, kid. Don't let go." The sun didn't set. The sky simply gave up. The grey overcast bruised into a deep, sickly purple, and then collapsed into absolute black. The rain turned to sleet, tiny chips of ice that felt like needles against exposed skin. With the darkness came a terrifying, suffocating intimacy. The battlefield shrank to the radius of what you could touch or hear. The mechanical roar of the daytime fight was gone, replaced by the crackle of burning vehicles, the hissing of the sleet, and the wet, agonizing sounds of men dying in the dark. The crater was a nightmare of blind triage. Cora couldn't use a headlamp. A white light would invite a sniper round or a mortar strike in seconds. She worked by feel, her hands submerged in the dark, sticky fluids of strangers. The smell was overwhelming. Copper from the blood, ammonia from voided bladders, and the pungent, rotten egg stench of the burning BMP up the ridge. It permeated her clothing, her hair, the very pores of her skin. "Talk to me, Reed," Cora said. Her voice was hoarse, stripped raw by the cold and the screaming. She was kneeling beside a staff sergeant whose throat had been torn open by a piece of shrapnel. Private First Class Toby Reed, the kid who had held her at gunpoint on the riverbank, was kneeling opposite her. He had become her impromptu surgical assistant. He was terrified, useless with a rifle, but he followed orders with the desperate obedience of a drowning man clinging to a log. "I can't feel a pulse on his wrist, Chief," Reed whispered, his teeth chattering so loudly Cora could hear them over the sleet. "Check the carotid," Cora ordered, her fingers tracing the slippery, ruined flesh of the sergeant's neck. "Right side, the left is gone." She felt Reed's trembling fingers brush against her own in the dark. "It's there," he stammered, "but it's weak, fast, like a little bird." "He's bleeding into his own airway," Cora said flatly. The sergeant was making a horrific gurgling sound, a wet, rattling snore. He was drowning in his own blood. "I have to crick him." A cricothyroidotomy, slicing through the membrane of the throat to insert a breathing tube directly into the windpipe. In a sterile, brightly lit trauma bay, it was a highly stressful procedure. In the freezing, pitch-black mud of a crater, it was butchery. "Hold his head back," Cora commanded. "Extend the neck. Do not let him thrash." She pulled a scalpel from her chest rig. She couldn't see the blade. She could only feel the cold, knurled metal of the handle. With her left hand, she traced the sergeant's throat, her thumb and middle finger gripping the slippery cartilage of his Adam's apple. "Find the divot, the cricothyroid membrane, there." "Hold him," she warned. She pressed the scalpel down and sliced horizontally. The sergeant bucked. The human body, even unconscious and dying, recognizes when its throat is being cut. The man arched his back, a violent spasm that nearly threw Cora off him. "Pin him, Reed," she snarled. Reed threw his entire body weight across the man's chest, sobbing in the dark. I got him, just do it." Cora dropped the scalpel into the mud. She didn't have time to find a retractor. She shoved her bare, bloody index finger directly into the fresh incision, hooking the cartilage and pulling it downward to keep the hole open. The blood was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing sleet. With her right hand, she fumbled in her drop pouch, retrieving a plastic endotracheal tube. She guided it down her own finger, sliding the curved plastic past the vocal cords and into the trachea. She pulled her finger out. A sudden wet hiss erupted from the plastic tube, followed by a fine spray of warm blood that hit Cora squarely in the cheek. The sergeant took a deep, rattling breath through the plastic straw protruding from his neck. "He's breathing," Reed gasped, wiping his face. "Chief, he's breathing." "Tape it," Cora said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Tape it down, pack the wound around it with gauze. Don't let the tube slip." She sat back on her heels, the freezing mud seeping through the worn fabric of her pants. Her hands were shaking violently now, a combination of adrenaline dump and hypothermia. She reached up and wiped the sergeant's blood off her cheek. It smeared, sticky and tack-like, against her cold skin. She looked across the crater. The faint orange glow from the burning armor cast long, shifting shadows. There were roughly 40 men in the pit now. They had dragged the wounded back during the lull. "Davies." The voice was weak, coming from the far side of the crater. "Captain O'Rourke." Cora crawled over to him. He was propped against a sandbag, shivering uncontrollably. His shattered arm had been splintered with 2 pieces of a broken ammunition crate and wrapped in a torn uniform blouse. But the blood had soaked through. "Status, Chief," he whispered. 3 dead in the last hour," Cora said clinically. 4 more won't make it to dawn unless we get whole blood and surgical intervention. The rest are stable, but the cold is going to start killing them faster than the bullets." O'Rourke nodded slowly, his eyes closed. "The radio. Brody got through on the HF net, just for a second." Cora leaned in closer. "And the armored column from Sector 4 got bogged down in the mud flats," O'Rourke said, a bitter, rattling laugh escaping his chest. "Tanks are stuck. They're waiting for the engineers to lay matting. They aren't pushing the flank tonight." Cora stared at him in the dark. The words didn't compute at first. No flank, no armor. "Medevac?" she asked. "Ceiling is too low. Sleet is freezing the rotors. Command grounded all birds until 0600. O'Rourke opened his eyes. In the dim light, they looked sunken, like bruises on a corpse. "We're on our own, Davies, for the next 9 hours. Cora looked down at her medical rug. It looked deflated. "I'm out of combat gauze," she said quietly. "I'm out of TXA. I have 2 tourniquets left. If they push us again, I can't plug the holes." O'Rourke reached out with his good hand and gripped her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Then you figure it out, Chief. You stole them back from the Reaper once today. Keep them breathing, whatever it takes." He let go of her wrist and closed his eyes again. Cora sat in the mud, 9 hours, in freezing sleet, with no supplies. A heavy silence fell over the crater, broken only by the shivering of the men and the distant rhythmic thumping of enemy artillery hammering another grid square. Cora looked at her empty hands. The blood on them was drying, pulling at her skin like tight gloves, whatever it takes. She stood up. Her knees popped loudly. "Reed," she said softly. The kid looked up from the sergeant. "Yeah, Chief?" "Take my sidearm. Watch the ridge." "Where are you going?" Reed asked, panic edging into his voice. "You can't leave the perimeter." "I'm not," Cora said. She turned and looked up the muddy slope toward the lip of the crater, where the dead from the initial assault had been laid in a neat, grim row. "I'm going shopping." Stealing from the dead violates a taboo so ancient and ingrained that it physically turns the stomach. Cora felt the bile rising in her throat as she low-crawled out of the crater, her belly dragging through the freezing slush. The wind howled across the open ground, biting through her soaked combat shirt. She was exposed up here. If an enemy flare went up, she would be silhouetted against the dark earth, an easy target for a sniper in the tree line. But the cold was the more immediate killer. She reached the first body. It was the corporal, the one she had let die to fire the AT-4. He lay on his back, his eyes staring blindly into the falling sleet. His skin was already the color of wet marble. The freezing rain was washing the blood from his face, leaving him looking terrifyingly young. Cora paused, her breath plumed in the air. For a split second, the humanity of it all threatened to crush her. This was a son, a brother, a kid who liked bad music and complained about the chow. He was a universe of memories, snuffed out in a fraction of a second, in a muddy field that didn't even have a name. She violently shoved the thought away. Compartmentalize. You are a mechanic. He is broken machinery. Strip the parts. She reached out and grabbed the zipper of the corporal's IFAK, his individual first aid kit, strapped to his vest. The zipper was jammed with mud. She yanked it hard. The nylon teeth tore open with a loud, tearing sound that seemed to echo across the battlefield. She rummaged inside. 2 packets of compressed gauze, a chest seal, a pressure dressing. She shoved them into her dump pouch. She looked at his chest rig. He had a tourniquet threaded through the mole webbing on his shoulder. It was tied down with rubber bands. Cora pulled her knife and sword through the bands, freeing the tourniquet. She shoved it into her pocket. Then she hesitated. She looked at the corporal's tactical fleece jacket, zipped tightly under his plate carrier. It was dry on the inside. Down in the crater, O'Rourke was shivering himself into cardiac arrest. Cora's jaw tightened. She unbuckled the dead man's plate carrier, wrestling the heavy ceramic plates off his stiffening torso. The body shifted with a sickening, heavy slackness. She unzipped his fleece. As she pulled it off his shoulders, his head rolled lifelessly, his cheek brushing against her knuckles. It was ice cold. "Sorry, kid," she muttered into the wind. It was the first time she had spoken to the dead. It felt pathetic, a weak apology to the void. She tucked the fleece under her arm and low-crawled to the next body. A lance corporal, missing his lower jaw from a piece of shrapnel. She stripped his IFAK. She took his gloves. She took the chemical warming packets out of his trouser pockets. She moved down the line. 6 bodies, 6 harvests. Her dump pouch was bulging with stolen life-saving equipment. Her hands were numb, clumsy blocks of meat. As she was rolling the final body, a massive gunner who had taken a round to the helmet, something fell out of his thigh pocket and landed in the mud with a soft thud. Cora picked it up. It was a protein bar, the cheap, chalky kind they handed out in the chow hall. The wrapper was half torn. He had been eating it when the bridge blew. Cora stared at it. Her stomach cramped violently. She hadn't eaten in 20 hours. She had burned thousands of calories swimming the river, fighting the current, dragging bodies, firing a rocket. Her blood sugar was crashing. She was running on pure cortisol and adrenaline, and the tank was hitting empty. To eat the dead man's food. It was a line, a gross, feral line. A mortar round impacted 200 yards to the east, throwing a momentary flash of yellow light across the mud. In that split second, Cora saw her own hands. They were caked in mud, dried blood, and pieces of tissue. She looked like a ghoul. She felt like one. She didn't cry. She didn't have a moment of profound moral revelation. She just tore the rest of the wrapper off with her teeth and took a bite. The bar was stale, freezing cold, and tasted faintly of the copper blood on her fingers. She chewed mechanically, swallowing the dense, chalky mass. It hit her stomach like a lead weight, but almost immediately, the uncontrollable shaking in her core lessened by a fraction. Survival was a math equation, and she had just added a few calories to her side of the ledger. She shoved the rest of the bar into her pocket, gathered the stolen fleeces and medical supplies, and slithered backward down the slick, steep wall of the crater. She landed at the bottom with a soft splash. The crater was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the wounded. "Chief?" Reed whispered from the dark. "I'm here," Cora said. She moved toward O'Rourke's position. She knelt beside the captain, lifted his head, and awkwardly wrestled the stolen fleece jacket onto his good arm, draping the rest over his chest. O'Rourke stirred. Where did you get this?" he slurred. "Quartermaster," Cora lied smoothly. She pulled a chemical warming packet from her pocket, cracked it, shook it until it grew hot, and shoved it under O'Rourke's armpit to warm his circulating blood. "Don't ask questions, sir. Just stay warm." She moved back to the center of the crater. She dumped her pouch onto a relatively dry ammunition crate. In the dim light, she counted her haul. 4 tourniquets, 8 rolls of gauze, 6 pressure dressings, 3 chest seals. It wasn't a hospital, but it was enough. It was enough to fight the Reaper for a few more hours. Cora sat on the edge of the crate, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her broken ribs. The pain was a dull, heavy throb now, a constant companion that anchored her to reality. She looked up at the sky. The sleet was turning into snow, large, heavy flakes that drifted down into the pit, covering the blood and the mud in a thin, deceptive layer of white. "Hey, Reed," she said quietly. "Yeah, Chief." "What time is it?" She heard the rustle of nylon as Reed checked his watch. 0200. 4 hours until dawn." 4 hours. 240 minutes. Every minute was going to be a battle of attrition against the cold, the bleeding, and the inevitable counterattack. Cora picked up a roll of stolen gauze. She tossed it lightly in her hand, feeling the weight of it. "All right," she said, her voice hard, stripped of all comfort and pretense. "Let's get to work." The military calls it the witching hour, that dead stretch of time between 0300 and 0400, when the body's circadian rhythm hits rock bottom. It is the time when the core temperature drops, the brain begs for unconsciousness, and the wounded quietly slip away. By 0315, the snow had coated the crater in 2 inches of pristine, mocking white. It covered the bloodstains. It covered the discarded wrappers of combat gauze. It covered the faces of the men who had stopped breathing. Cora's hands no longer felt like parts of her own body. They were wooden prosthetics attached to the ends of her wrists. She couldn't feel the plastic tape she was ripping. She couldn't feel the pulse she was supposed to be checking. She had to rely entirely on visual cues in the oppressive dark, using a tiny red lens penlight held between her teeth. She knelt beside a Marine named Bennett. He was 22, a heavy machine gunner. He hadn't been hit by a bullet. He'd been thrown against the engine block of a Humvee when the bridge blew. His pelvis was shattered. Cora knew it the moment she touched his hips and felt the sickening, free-floating crunch of bone grinding against bone. A shattered pelvis meant massive internal hemorrhage. The pelvic basin could hold liters of blood before the pressure stopped the bleeding. By then, the patient was usually dead. Bennett was entirely lucid, which made it worse. "Chief," he whispered. His voice was incredibly thin, like paper tearing. Cora leaned in close. The snow was settling on his eyelashes. He wasn't blinking it away. "I'm right here, Bennett. Don't talk. Conserve your energy." "I'm thirsty," he said. "In trauma medicine, You do not give oral fluids to a casualty with internal injuries. If a surgeon has to open them up, a stomach full of water leads to aspiration and death on the operating table. It was a hard, unbreakable rule, beaten into every corpsman from day one. Cora looked at him. His lips were cracked and blue. The skin around his eyes was pulling tight against the skull. He didn't have a radial pulse. His body was shunting all available blood to his heart and brain, sacrificing the limbs to keep the engine running for a few more minutes. He wasn't going to see a surgeon. He wasn't going to see the sun rise. Cora unclipped her canteen. The water inside was freezing, slushy with ice. She unscrewed the cap with her numb, clumsy fingers. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him he was going to be fine. She just lifted his head gently, her palm cradling the base of his skull, and brought the canteen to his lips. "Slow," she instructed quietly. Bennett drank. The water spilled down his chin, mixing with the dirt on his neck. He swallowed audibly, a desperate, clicking sound in his throat. He coughed slightly, then let his head fall back against her hand. "Thanks," he breathed. "You're welcome." Cora sat back on her heels. She watched the rise and fall of his chest. It grew shallower, slower. Then the rhythm simply stopped. The chest remained still. His jaw went slack. Cora didn't check for a pulse. She just reached out, her frozen fingers brushing against his eyelids, and gently closed them. She stood up. Her broken ribs grated against each other. A sharp, mechanical click inside her chest that radiated a dull fire through her torso. She felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea. It wasn't the blood or the death. It was the sheer, suffocating exhaustion. She wanted to lie down in the snow, just for 5 minutes. If she closed her eyes, the cold would stop hurting. It would just feel like a heavy, warm blanket. No, she bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted fresh copper. The sharp pain snapped the tether of her fading consciousness, yanking her back to reality. She turned and saw Reed. The kid was sitting on an overturned ammo can, his rifle across his lap, staring blankly at the snow. He was vibrating with cold. Cora walked over and kicked his boot. Hard. Reed flinched, his head snapping up, his hands fumbling for the pistol grip of his M4. "Don't fall asleep," Cora growled, her voice a harsh rasp. "If you fall asleep, you freeze. If you freeze, I have to drag your dead weight out of here, and my back already hurts. Stand up." Reed blinked, his face a mask of misery. "Chief, I can't feel my feet." "Good. That means they aren't on fire. Stand up, Reed." He groaned, forcing himself to his feet. He swayed slightly, looking like a drunk. "Walk the perimeter," Cora ordered. "Check the bandages on the walking wounded. Make sure nobody has bled through their dressings. Keep moving." Reed nodded numbly and stumbled away into the dark. Cora watched him go. She hated being hard on him, but empathy was a luxury that killed people in the cold. Empathy let you rest. Anger kept you alive. She fueled her anger. She hated the river. She hated the enemy artillery. She hated the snow. She looked up at the sky. The heavy overcast was beginning to thin, turning from pitch black to the color of wet slate. Dawn was coming, and with the light, the enemy would see that Fox Company was still breathing. The attack didn't start with an artillery barrage. It started with a whisper. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie, muffled silence over the snow-covered battlefield. Cora was kneeling beside Captain O'Rourke, checking the tourniquet on his shattered arm. The bleeding had stopped, but the flesh below the nylon band was cold and mottled grey. He was unconscious, his breathing ragged. Then she heard it. Crunch, squeak. The unmistakable sound of boots compressing fresh snow. It wasn't just one pair, it was dozens. Cora froze. She slowly turned her head towards the eastern lip of the crater. The sky was a pale, bruised purple. Against the dim light, she saw a silhouette cresting the mud embankment. It wasn't an armored vehicle this time. It was infantry. They had crawled through the mud flats under the cover of the snowstorm, bypassing the heavy guns, looking to slit throats in the dark. "Contact!" Cora hissed. Her voice was too dry to yell. She cleared her throat and screamed it. "Contact! East Ridge!" The crater erupted into chaotic, disjointed violence. The Marines who were conscious, the walking wounded, the half-frozen riflemen, snapped awake. Weapons clattered against frozen gear. The silhouette on the ridge raised a rifle. Cora didn't think. She drew the Glock 19 from her hip holster. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel the trigger, but muscle memory took over. She brought the weapon up, punching it out with both hands, aligned the tritium night sights, and fired twice. Crack, crack. The flashes blinded her for a fraction of a second. When her vision cleared, the silhouette was gone, tumbling backward down the embankment. "They're in the wire!" someone screamed. A heavy machine gun from the tree line opened up, a deafening rhythmic chug, chug, chug that tore through the lip of the crater, showering Cora with frozen mud and ice. Suppressive fire. They were pinning the Marines down while the assault element pushed in. Shadows poured over the eastern edge of the pit. It became a point-blank brawl. It was too close for the Marines to use their optics. It was just muzzle flashes, screaming, and the sickening thud of rifle stocks hitting bone. Cora dropped into a low crouch, shielding O'Rourke's unconscious body with her own. An enemy soldier slid down the slick mud wall, landing 5 feet from her. He was wearing a white winter smock, his face obscured by a balaclava. He swung his rifle towards the wounded captain. Cora fired her Glock. The weapon clicked. Empty chamber. She had forgotten to swap magazines after the initial assault yesterday. The soldier saw her. He lunged forward, the bayonet on his rifle aimed directly at her chest. Cora didn't back away. She stepped inside the arc of the weapon. She grabbed the hot barrel of his rifle with her bare left hand. The metal seared her palm, but she didn't let go. She twisted her hips, driving her right elbow directly into the man's throat. The soldier gagged, his momentum faltering. Cora swept his leg, dropping him into the freezing muck. Before he could recover, she drew the folding knife from her chest rig, flicked it open, and drove it into the soft pocket of flesh beneath his collarbone, angling downward toward the heart. He thrashed violently, his hands clawing at her face, smearing her goggles with blood. She held him down, twisting the blade until the thrashing stopped. She pulled the knife out, her breath coming in ragged, painful tears. Her ribs were agonizing, blindingly painful. The fight around her was a meat grinder. The crater was too small. Friendly fire was as much a risk as the enemy. Reed was firing his M4 from the hip, backing away until he tripped over a dead body. An enemy soldier raised a shovel to cave Reed's head in. Cora scooped up the dead man's rifle from the mud. It was an AK variant, heavy and unfamiliar. She didn't shoulder it. She just pointed the barrel at the soldier, threatening Reed, and held the trigger down. The weapon roared, kicking violently in her hands. The recoil drove the stock into her fractured ribs. She screamed in pure agony, but she didn't release the trigger until the magazine clicked empty. The soldier was thrown backward against the mud wall, practically cut in half. The burst of automatic fire seemed to break the assault. The remaining enemy infantry, realizing the crater wasn't full of sleeping victims, but cornered, desperate animals, scrambled back up the embankment, disappearing into the grey dawn. Cora dropped the empty rifle. She fell to her knees. The adrenaline vanished, leaving nothing but a vast, hollow void. The pain in her chest was so absolute, it made her vision swim. She looked at her left hand. The palm was blistered and charred from grabbing the hot barrel. She couldn't feel it. "Chief!" Reed was crawling toward her. His face was covered in someone else's blood. He looked completely shattered. "I'm okay," Cora lied, her voice a wet rasp. She spat a mouthful of blood into the snow. She had bitten her tongue during the fight. "Check the wounded. Who got hit?" "Nobody," Reed said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "They missed the CCP. They were aiming for the fighting positions." Cora nodded slowly. She let herself sit back in the snow. She leaned against a frozen sandbag. The sky above them was finally turning blue. The snow had stopped. Then she heard a sound. It didn't belong to the battlefield. It was a low, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in her chest cavity. It grew louder, a mechanical, heavy chopping noise that cut through the silence of the dawn. Thwack, 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 thwack. Cora tilted her head back. Breaking through the low grey clouds, hugging the tree line, were 3 AH-64 Apache gunships. Their chin-mounted cannons were swiveling, scanning the woods where the enemy had retreated. Behind them, massive and beautiful, were the blunt, heavy shapes of 2 CH-47 Chinook helicopters, their twin rotors beating the freezing air into submission. "Medevac," Reed whispered, tears suddenly cutting fresh tracks through the dirt on his face. "Chief, it's the birds." Cora didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes and let her head rest against the frozen sandbag. "About damn time," she muttered. The arrival of the cavalry is never as romantic as it looks in paintings. It is loud, chaotic, and violently disruptive. The Chinooks flared over the crater, their massive downwash kicking up a blizzard of mud, snow, and discarded medical debris. Cora had to shield her face with her unburned hand as a storm of frozen dirt pelted her goggles. The rear ramp of the lead helicopter lowered before the wheels even touched the earth. A team of pararescue men, PJs, poured out. They wore clean plate carriers, fresh helmets, and dry uniforms. To Cora, they looked like aliens. They moved with the crisp, frantic energy of men who had just entered the fight, completely jarring against the slow, sluggish misery of the Marines in the crater. A PJ sprinted over to Cora. He dropped to one knee, a massive medical bag slung over his shoulder. He took one look at her, covered in dried gore, her face grey, her left hand burned raw, clutching her ribs, and reached for a pair of trauma shears. "I got you, Chief. Let's get this rig off." Cora swatted his hand away. It took all her remaining strength. "I'm not the patient," she croaked, pointing a trembling finger toward O'Rourke. "He's an officer. Left arm shattered, tourniquet applied 6 hours ago. Hypovolemic shock. Get him whole blood right now, or he loses the arm and his life." The PJ blinked, realizing the blood-soaked monster in front of him was the medic. He nodded sharply. "Copy that. We got him." Cora pointed to the other side of the crater. "Staff sergeant over there. I cricked him at 0200. The tube is unstable. Keep his neck immobilized. 4 tension pneumothoraxes on the right flank, all decompressed, but the needles are probably clogged by now. Get chest tubes in them." She rattled off the injuries, the interventions, the times of tourniquet applications, and the doses of imaginary drugs she wished she had given. She dumped the entire terrifying database she had held in her head for the last 12 hours onto the fresh medic. When she was finished, the PJ just stared at her for a second. He looked around the crater. There were bodies lined up, but there were also 40 men breathing who had no statistical right to be alive. "You did all this?" he asked softly. "By yourself?" "I had help," Cora said, looking over at Reed. The kid was sitting in the snow, being wrapped in a thick foil hypothermia blanket by a flight nurse. He looked small. "All right, Chief. Let's get you on the bird," the PJ said, gently hooking a hand under her armpit. "I can walk," Cora said stubbornly. She stood up. The moment she put weight on her boots, the world tilted sideways. The adrenaline that had been propping up her ruined body finally evaporated. The pain in her ribs wasn't just a click anymore. It was a white-hot knife twisting into her lungs. The exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled. She didn't hit the mud. The PJ caught her, easily lifting her dead weight. "No, you can't," he said gently. "I got you." Cora didn't fight him. She let her head fall against his clean chest rig. It smelled like fresh laundry detergent and antiseptic. It was the best thing she had ever smelled. He carried her up the ramp of the Chinook. The interior of the helicopter was deafening, smelling of aviation fuel and hot hydraulic fluid. The cabin was already filling with stretchers. The PJ strapped her into a web seat near the ramp. He wrapped a thick fleece blanket around her shaking shoulders and placed a pair of foam earplugs into her hands. "We're lifting off in 30 seconds, he yelled over the turbine whine. "Sit tight." Cora looked out the open ramp. Down in the mud, the last of the wounded were being loaded. The crater was emptying out, leaving behind only the discarded armor, the empty rifles, and the neat, horrible row of the men who wouldn't be flying home sitting up. She saw the river in the distance. The current was still raging, choking on the debris of the bridge. It looked entirely indifferent to what had happened on its banks. The water would keep flowing. The mud would freeze solid. In a month, the snow would melt, and this unnamed grid square would just be an empty field again. The Chinook shuddered, the massive engines spooling up to full power. The helicopter lifted off the ground, tilting forward. The crater, the mud, and the river shrank away, swallowed by the vast grey expanse of the winter morning. Cora pulled the blanket tighter around her chest. She looked down at her hands. The blood on them had dried so thoroughly it looked like dark rust. She knew it would take weeks to wash out of her cuticles. She knew she would smell the copper in her sleep for the rest of her life. She leaned her head back against the vibrating bulkhead. She survived. They survived. It wasn't a victory. It was just a refusal to die. In the mud, there are no heroes. There is only the math of who bleeds, who breathes, and who refuses to let go of the gauze. War strips away the myth of the superhero and leaves behind only the grim, mechanical reality of survival. Chief Cora Davies didn't win a battle. She just held off the Reaper with sheer stubbornness and a roll of stolen gauze. It's a brutal reminder of the real cost paid in the mud. If this deep dive into the raw, unfiltered truth of combat medicine gripped you, smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. What part of Cora's desperate triage surprised you the most? We'll see you in the next deep dive.